Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final installment of the 2025 Fall Semester Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Sabrina Higgins, and I'm the director for the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies here, and I'll be moderating today's talk. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. I'm very pleased to present today's speaker, wrapping up our series of talks for the year, our very own Dr. David Mirhady of the Department of Global Humanities at SFU. Dr. Mirhady's research spans several related fields: Greek rhetoric, law, and the school of Aristotle. It began with a dissertation on the political and legal writings of Aristotle's student Theophrastus. And in order to get a background for that, he looked at Aristotle's approach to legal argumentation in his rhetoric, which led to articles on the parallel accounts of argumentation on documentary forms of evidence in rhetoric, its contemporary, the Rhetoric to Alexander, and in the Athenian orators, the speeches of one of whom, Socrates, he translated. He's also continued his interest in the parallels between the rhetoric and the Rhetoric to Alexander, which led to a Loeb translation of the latter. We're very pleased to have him here today, and I will pass it over to Dr.
Thanks very much, Sabrina. And thank you all for coming. It's our first day of good weather in the whole month, so I'm honored that you're here. Although I've opened the blinds so I can see the beautiful view, and most of you haven't yet done so. Of course, I'm not teaching this term, so my voice isn't used to speaking. It may give out, but I need to give some background for those. I mean, there's much in my paper that will seem dead obvious to many of you, so bear with me. And as in anything to do with computers, it'll go from dead obvious to completely incomprehensible very quickly. So watch for that moment. But so here's some of the dead obvious that we're talking about: Socrates, and who was put to death after the trial in 399 BC. But through his lifetime, Athens was a place where traveling teachers, sophists, such as Gorgias, Protagoras, Theodorus, and Thrasymachus came. You've probably heard of Gorgias and Protagoras, maybe Theodorus and Thrasymachus, not so much, but they play a big role in my paper. So just understand that this is where they are. Athens fought through the Peloponnesian War with interruptions from 431 to 404, during which Aristophanes' Clouds was performed, and the Clouds plays also a big role in this paper as one of the sources of the slander that Socrates is dealing with. We then had at the end of the war, the tyranny of the 30 imposed by the Spartans on the Athenians, a very violent time in Athens, followed by the restoration of democracy. So, so much for the historical background. Although I say in Socrates' Apology, as the introduction made clear, my heart is actually later, in the 4th century, almost a century after the Sophists, and a couple generations maybe after Socrates was put to death, in Aristotle's Rhetoric and Anaximenes, Rhetoric to Alexander. I think we should just go ahead and say it's by Anaximenes, although all the books will say pseudo-Aristotle. The evidence is pretty good enough to say that it's Anaximenes. But they're essentially contemporary works. And the thrust of my research, right from the time when I began, and Sabrina mentioned papers I was doing then, has been to try to find out what these two texts have in common. And in order to sort of triangulate both what that common text was from which both authors created their own works, and then ultimately to go back through that common text to people like Theodorus and Thrasymachus, and perhaps Protagoras and Gorgias as well, who I think really are the intellectual starting point for much of what Aristotle and Anaximenes are doing in their 4th century rhetorical handbooks. So, enough background. Onto the paper. In this paper, I'm discussing diabolē. I'm going to say diabolē. Maybe you want to hear diabolē, but I don't do that so easily. So I'm going to stick with my old-fashioned pronunciation. I'm translating this word diabolē as slander. But I should avoid confusion. I should acknowledge that in modern law, both slander and libel are types of defamation, and they're against the law. Modern slander involves an untrue defamatory statement that is spoken orally, and libel an untrue defamatory statement that is made in writing. The diabolē that I am discussing was not illegal in Athens. Although there were forms of defamation that were illegal, such as saying Dmitri threw away his shield in battle, or saying that so-and-so killed his father. These statements were called aporeta, forbidden speech, and they provoked a suit for kategoria. Diabolē did not rise to this level. As I hope to clarify, diabolē in rhetorical terms was a form of slander that provoked prejudice, mainly against an opposing speaker, and so undermined that person or his case's credibility. If the diabolē involved a claim that the person had actually done something illegal, then the proper response would have been a prosecution, not bad-mouthing. Blurring such lines was entirely possible. Moreover, the Athenians had a scrutiny procedure, the so-called dokimasia rhetoron, which examined whether the person was or had been involved in behavior, such as prostitution, that rendered him entirely unworthy of credibility and so forbade him performing the role of a rhetor. There was then a continuum of objects for slander, and diabolē, in a rhetorical context, dealt with those that did not rise to the level of those that led to losing the right to speak, let alone worse punishments, but diminished the opposing speaker's credibility. The rhetorical treatises of Anaximenes and Aristotle both devote chapters to slander, as did Aristotle's student at the Peripatos, Theophrastus. You know, as Sabrina mentioned that I wrote my dissertation on Theophrastus, so I sneak him in every chance I get. They occur amid treatments of the parts of a speech, following the introduction, the proem, and before the narrative. However, these chapters are not anticipated in the discussion of the parts of a speech that are attributed by both Plato and Aristotle to the 5th century sophist Theodorus of Byzantium. There may have been as many as 12 parts of a speech in Theodorus's accounts, but there was no part for diabolē. That Aristotle and Anaximenes nevertheless include one suggests that it originated after Theodorus, but it must have been in the common treatise that Aristotle and Anaximenes used as the model for theirs, since their treatises align quite closely regarding the parts of a speech. However, its appearance in the handbook tradition appears short. None of the Roman handbooks includes an account of it. In fact, the Romans replaced diabolē with what they call insinuatio, a sort of remedy by which a Cicero, for instance, when confronted by a case that alienates his listeners, might insinuate himself into their good graces. That is, the Roman rhetoricians seem to see a need to bypass diabolē and the prejudice that it causes or exploits, and to proceed directly to remedying such a prejudice. The fact that the Roman rhetoricians acknowledge the Greek term ephodos as equivalent to insinuatio also suggests that there was an intermediate step. Diabolē was abandoned already in the Greek rhetorical tradition in favor of ephodos sometime between the 4th century and the 1st. By far, our most extensive discussion of diabolē among the Athenian speeches is in Plato's Apology of Socrates, his defense speech. And he has Socrates respond to what are implied to be stock rhetorical attacks. That raises questions about the origins of such stock slandering. Since the origins of rhetorical treatments of diabolē seem to go back to the sophist Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, in whom Plato took such greatest interest in his Republic, it seems entirely possible that in the Apology, Plato has Thrasymachus's teachings in mind, and that the later treatises also reflect his legacy in some way. In his Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates identify Thrasymachus as having authored a techne, a rhetorical handbook, based on eliciting pity through tears, anger, and diabolē. And he puts special emphasis on Thrasymachus and diabolē, his skill both at provoking it and in removing it. Aristotle attributes these same three elements to the composers of rhetorical treatises at the beginning of his rhetoric, where it also seems quite likely that Aristotle has Thrasymachus principally in mind. But we can say very little about what was in Thrasymachus's account, despite the interest Plato shows in Thrasymachus and in techne in the Republic. According to Aristotle, Thrasymachus wrote a handbook on appeals to pity, the eloi, and to have touched on delivery, which may have involved, for instance, adopting a piteous stance on the speaker's platform. I'm not going to illustrate. The tearful speeches dragging in old age and poverty. I could give that a whirl. These are mentioned in the Phaedrus. Even bringing up the speaker's wife and children to elicit some compassion, a technique that Socrates mentions in the Apology as by way of rejecting it, what the rhetoricians call praeteritio. But our other sources for Thrasymachus simply praise his style for its precision and clarity as a sort of perfect mean in style. One of Socrates' chief concerns in the Apology is that he's defending himself not just against the accusations and speeches of the current prosecutors, but against long-standing slanders that undermine his position. So far as we can tell, the slanders focus on three areas that are not actually the direct subject of the trial, and they would not have led to prosecution in themselves. They focus on Socrates being engaged in something peculiar. And as he says, they create disinformation, envy, and even hatred against him, making him out to be a sophist, a meddler, and an anti-democrat. They both undermine his credibility as a speaker and, of course, complement the charges of the prosecution. One source of the slanders against Socrates was, of course, Aristophanes' clowns, first performed 24 years before Socrates' trial in 423. People got some ideas from the play. They may not have been the ideas that Aristophanes himself intended. Be that as it may, over time, these people persuaded others about them. Socrates voices frustration that he cannot confront those people who, long before, had created misinformation about him, making him out to be a natural historian, a sophist, and a rhetor. Specifically, and as we know from our own reading of the play, the clouds caricatures Socrates as studying and teaching astronomy and geology, I guess that's a kind way of putting it, in a purely materialist way, from which people might infer that he did not believe in the gods and taught atheism. The play also portrays him as making the weaker argument stronger, suggesting that he teaches skills of being a sophistic rhetor, and that, like the sophists, he takes money for his instruction. Another source of slander is Socrates' own investigations into the supposed wisdom of various public figures. He claims to have undertaken such investigations as a mission from God, as a sort of Herculean labor. When his friend Chaerephon was told at Delphi that there was no one wiser than Socrates. However, when, as part of his investigations, he repeatedly refuted politicians, poets, and tradespeople, they took it as an affront to their honor, which incited their jealousy, and they started calling him a wise man, a sophos aner, or as I like to say sometimes, a wise guy. Others hear that and repeat it to others over a long period of time. A third source of slander arose from the claim that Socrates was a teacher of young men who went on to become members of the tyrannical anti-democratic 30. Of course, Socrates denies that he was ever a teacher at all, and he clarifies that he never consented to doing anything unjust. In other contexts, however, Socrates names several of the young men who associated with him, even if he denies that he was their teacher. They also had nothing to do with the 30. He also mentions that he avoided cooperating with the 30 and their tyrannical activities that were aimed at persecuting Democrats. Based on Socrates' descriptions of these three sources of slander, we might make several inferences about a general rhetoric of diabolē, even if we had no other sources. First, slanders are said to be false. According to Socrates, he is not a clever speaker, as the slanderers claim, unless that means speaking the truth. Socrates does not do geology or astronomy. He does not do sophistic rhetoric. He is not a wise man, and he's nobody's teacher. And he had as little to do with the 30 as he could. These claims are all parts of false stories about him, not just critical narratives about him that apply pejorative adjectives. The fact that diabolē is characterized as false complicates the idea that anyone would teach how to do it, since teachers of rhetoric generally shy away from explicit falsification. For a study like mine, which depends greatly on the actual appearance of the noun diabolē or its verb diabalein, such a complication is serious. I can't cite critical narratives that undermine a speaker's credibility unless they are characterized as diabolē, such as when antiphone speakers include criticisms that entire prosecutions are slanders. A prosecutor's criticisms of a defendant's character that support his demonstration that the defendant committed an alleged wrong are theoretically, rhetorical theory-wise, something different from those that undermine the defendant's credibility, but they're obviously closely related. And unless you want to split some hairs, yeah. Interestingly, the rhetorical handbooks take a very different approach to the falsity of diabolē. Anaximenes recommends anticipation. They love these technical words, prokatalepsis. She says, I am also not unaware that there is diabolē against me, and I shall show that the diabolē is false. However, Aristotle takes a more defensive approach. To confront the disputed points of the diabolē, either say that they are not so, or that they are not damaging, or not damaging to this man, or that they are not a big deal, or that they are not unjust, or not greatly unjust, or not shameful, or insignificant. In this passage, it would be easy to miss the argument that they are not so. The word false appears nowhere in Aristotle's account. Second, when referring to slander, a speaker may conflate it with a prosecution speech, that is, to refer to diabolē as kategoria. Socrates refers to the slanderers, such as Aristophanes, as the first prosecuting speakers, and again, the dangerous prosecuting speakers. He then suggests a relationship between kategoria and diabolē. He says, now let us take up from the beginning what the kategoria is from which the diabolē against me has arisen, the very one on which Meletus relied when he composed this charge against me. And then he recites the slander as if it were a formal charge. Interestingly, because the rhetorical handbooks make a point of assigning the word kategoria to a prosecution speech, they generally stick to their terminological guns and do not conflate it with diabolē. However, just as we sometimes translate diabolē as prejudice, where someone has prejudged something, both rhetorical handbooks employ the word krisis in unusual ways. Krisis is usually translated as judgment or sometimes as a trial. Aristotle gives an example. He refers to the judgment of Euripides Hippolytus, the krisis of Euripides Hippolytus, in a Dionysiac context. And the rhetoric to Alexander agrees that if there is diabolē, some judgment must have occurred. So a prejudgment, a prejudice. Third, slander is more dangerous because it often involves prejudices of the judges that already exist before, sometimes long before the trial takes place. In Socrates' case, the prejudices against him have been held since the judge's childhood, more than 20 years before, when the performance of Aristophanes' clouds led to the false ideas being circulated throughout the city. Socrates elaborates further on this topos by mentioning what a short time he has in which to remove the slander that has been acquired over such a long time. And later, that capital cases, such as his own, should not be decided in a single day when the slanders are so great. For us, the specific circumstances of the anti-Socratic slanders, their great longevity and so on, may not be so important as simply that the slanders are something pre-existing and widespread. If they really are pre-existing, then Meletus et al. are not inventing them afresh in the current trial. Following Socrates, both Aristotle and Anaximenes include arguments against diabolē in general, and both describe it as prosecuting diabolē. So actually, using both the word kategoria and diabolē together. Using the word kategorein that the rhetorical theorists usually reserve for prosecution speeches to be delivered in court. Anaximenes echoes Socrates quite closely, adding that many people have been ruined by unjust diabolē. Interestingly, this sort of condemnation of slander also appears in Herodotus. Isn't it great to be able to go to Herodotus? Well, John appreciates this. He doesn't talk very often about diabolē, but he gives quite an interesting discussion of it in Book 7. Slander is a terrible business. There are two in it who do wrong and one who suffers wrong. The slanderer wrongs another by prosecuting an absent man, and the other does wrong in that he is persuaded before he has learned the whole truth. The absent man does not hear what is said of him and suffers wrong in the matter, being maligned by the one and condemned by the other. An interesting intellectual puzzle about it all. This understanding of this nomos theis as condemned. Yeah. Well, I went through LSJ. I couldn't actually see that as a proper translation. But anyway, on to the next slide. We should note that in some ways Socrates gives as good as he gets. He not only formulates a quasi-charge against Meletus that the young prosecutor is not taking things seriously, but Socrates accuses Meletus of acting with hubris, a lack of restraint, and immaturity. Socrates does not characterize such criticisms as slander. A speaker never admits that he is slandering. And it's clearly tied to the arguments he is making in the current trial. Socrates' reaction is not based on long-standing prejudices. Meletus is a young guy. Nobody really knows him. It remains questionable whether it should be described as slander, that is, as diabolē, at all, or whether contemporaries would use some other word for such criticisms. And Greek has a lot of them. Boy, oh boy. Psagos, onedos, mempsis, baskania, loidoria, blasphemia are just some of the possibilities. But it is an attack against the opposing speaker, and it's clearly meant to discredit him. Anaximenes' Rhetoric to Alexander gives a fulsome treatment of slander as a sort of addendum to his introduction to a speech. And Aristotle has a comparable treatment also following his chapter on the introduction. As I said, it seems likely that these treatments, or at least the perceived need to do such treatments, originated with Thrasymachus. In his account of diabolē, Aristotle makes what for him is a typical beginning. You should know that Aristotle is actually very skeptical about the whole nature of the rhetorical enterprise. So, for instance, when he wants to describe what an introduction is, he says, just say what the speech is about and get on with it. And likewise, about slander, he says, he cuts through all the excess to focus on the essential, explaining that it really doesn't even matter whether anyone actually expressed any diabolē. The salient point is the presence of a troubling assumption. Okay? Hypolepsin duskere, in the hearer's mind, perhaps what we would describe as a prejudice, and the speaker must address such assumptions. From Aristotle's point of view, then, the diabolē is certainly pre-existing. It does not have to arise from anything an opponent has said, particularly through his speech, but certainly could and often would relate to what the opponent is saying. In any case, the speaker's response would be the same, whether his opponent has exploited such a prejudice or whether it simply was pre-existing. The account in the Rhetoric to Alexander appears to me to be more promising for finding connections to Socrates. One of the first issues it deals with is the charge of cleverness. We heard that before, didn't we? In the Apology, Socrates begins by saying that his opponents have claimed that he is clever at speaking, denos legein. It becomes clear later that this claim is part of the diabolē stemming from Aristophanes' clouds, that Socrates makes the weaker argument stronger, that he's a rhetor, that he uses fancy stylistics, and so on. Socrates' response is, first, to exclaim his wonder at how persuasively, that is, falsely, cleverly, the prosecutors spoke, and then to equate his own cleverness with speaking the truth. That is, he's saying that it's his opponents who are clever at speaking. The Rhetoric to Alexander's recommended response is that the speaker speaks what he believes to be the common good. The common good is his substitution for the truth. The Rhetoric to Alexander is clearly not confining itself only to law court contexts. It could also be in the assembly, in a deliberative situation. So it takes a broader approach than Socrates's, but the thrust seems similar. It goes on to touch on slanders that arise from the past and from the present. Again, the approach of the Rhetoric to Alexander is inclusive, but for those who have just been reading the Apology, we'll pretend you have been, it seems to follow its pattern as Socrates moves from the claim that he is a clever rhetor to his whole discussion of Aristophanes' clouds as essentially an earlier first categoria or diabolē against him. This does not seem the right occasion for continuing with a systematic discussion of the two accounts in Aristotle and Anaximenes. Okay, I kind of just didn't get around to it. What seems clear is that their methodologies are very different. In many ways, Aristotle seems to rely on the same repository of arguments that he uses elsewhere in the Rhetoric, where he lists different sorts of enthymemes, his big word. Also in the account of prooimia, where he discusses remedies, he says that defendants must discuss slanders at the beginning of speeches, but prosecutors must use them at the end. Socrates is a defendant, so his discussion of the diabolē is at the beginning of his speech. Likewise, in the Rhetoric to Alexander, diabolē plays a very reasonable role in what Anaximenes calls anticipation, the prokatalepsis, whose role is to dampen criticisms and disturbances that arise from slander. I'm going to go in quite a different direction now. In his second or other account of ethos, in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, Aristotle devotes 6 whole chapters to character types based on youth, old age, prime age, noble breeding, wealth, and ability. Although the account is somewhat pedestrian for those interested in the rhetorical credibility of a character, as I know all of you really are, the chapters seem almost a tour de force of artistic description, somewhat reminiscent, of course, of my Theophrastus's work, the characters. Aristotle obviously is having fun with these character descriptions. They consist of scarcely plausible generalizations of each of the 6 character types. So, for instance, the young, like most of you, are lustful, out of control, fickle, hot-headed, proud, simple-minded, and gullible. The old are positive about nothing. Boy, I can identify. They're malicious, small-minded, and ungenerous. I hope not. But those in their prime are not overconfident or too fearful, neither trusting nor distrusting everything, not stingy, or spendthrift. Those from noble families, he says, are ambitious, good-for-nothing maniacs. The wealthy are insolent, arrogant, luxurious, swaggering, domineering, foolish, insolent, and incontinent. But the capable are ambitious, manly, energetic, and dignified. These chapters seem largely to stem from Aristotle's own creative imagination, and they might apply just as well to drama as to rhetoric. In each of them, there are thoughts attributed to the 7 wise men and to the early Greek poets. It's a part of this kind of tour de force that he's employing. Notably, however, 4 of the 6 are largely negative. So they are presumably used to undermine someone, perhaps the opposing speaker, perhaps someone else. However, it seems significant to me that in his account of diabolē, Anaximenes says that the first thing that evokes diabolē is the speaker's age. From the present time, age is the first thing that evokes prejudice against speakers. When a very young man or an old man speaks publicly, there's annoyance. They think it's proper for the one not to be speaking yet, and for the other to have stopped. I'd like to suggest that my urtext, the common text for both Aristotle and Anaximenes, provides the basis for this overlap between the two. The negative thrust of most of Aristotle's chapters suggests that, like the account in the Rhetoric to Alexander, it stems from the text treatment of diabolē, argumentation to be used to diminish the credibility of the opposing speaker. But unlike Anaximenes, whose argumentation focuses on curing diabolē, Aristotle is giving it full voice here, at least for 4 of the 6 character types. Like Theophrastus's characters, Aristotle focuses on extremes, the stereotypical faults of the young and the old. But then he settles on mean states, those in their prime and those with ability. In his account, Anaximenes also notes those who speak too frequently and too seldom. Aristotle might have dealt with these as well, but he does not, perhaps because frequency of speech is too contingent a characteristic, whereas if you're young, you're young. Not much you can do about it. He chooses instead to fill out his treatment with the wealthy, the well-bred, and the capable. Anaximenes deals with the rich and poor and so on elsewhere in his text, and in distinguishing characteristics that are internal and external to virtue in his discussion of the arrangement of speeches of praise and criticism. Like Aristotle, he chooses to deal with issues related to the virtue of speakers when discussing epideictic. The common origins of the 2 accounts seem confirmed in traces of the source texts, where, after both texts have laid out positive accounts of character, they then sketch the rest, which Aristotle explicitly refers to as cures, iatrumata. Both authors relate such matters to diabolē, whether to dissolve or create it, and both relate it to the speakers themselves and to the subject matter, the pragma of the speech. Just as Aristotle says that he's interested in cures, Anaximenes focuses on overcoming prejudices, both from the past and the present, and concerning both the speaker and the subject matter, even the speech itself. As Plato suggests that these teachings originated with Thrasymachus. Three centuries later, in his treatment of Demosthenes, Dionysius of Halicarnassus excerpts a passage from a demagoric speech of Thrasymachus, given as a kind of sample speech. Interestingly, right at the beginning, it invokes just the sort of justification for a young person to speak that we see suggested by Anaximenes. I would have preferred to share in that ancient time in its affairs, when the young were required to be silent. Affairs did not compel public speaking, and the old directed the city well. But since God has assigned us to such a time as this, so that others rule the city while we listen and we suffer misfortunes, the misfortunes' worst aspects, neither the gods nor fate's doing, but the city managers, we are compelled to speak. This passage's invocation of both young and old, of former and contemporary times, and the clear, if implicit, diabolē against the opponents, all suggest that such an approach lies behind the approach of Anaximenes. And if my argument is accepted, it serves as a provocation for Aristotle as well. Some years ago, I argued in a paper that the concept of the investigative species, the exetastikon eidos, in the Rhetoric to Alexander should be seen as a response to Plato's denigration of rhetoric in the Gorgias. Anaximenes recruited a quintessentially Socratic dialectical method, the exetasis, the investigation or examination, which Plato outlines in the Apology, and gave it its own role within rather than, as Aristotle has it, as a counterpart to rhetoric. Today, I've tried to outline the role of slander in the Apology, a work in which slander is explicitly discussed more than in any other single work of classical Greek oratory. Again, I've suggested that when faced with the challenge of composing fresh material for an area of rhetoric that both he and Aristotle treated, Anaximenes in the Rhetoric to Alexander may have been more likely than Aristotle to have had a glance at Plato's Apology to get some ideas. Thanks for your attention.
Fantastic talk. I feel utterly inundated. There was so much stuff. I have quite a few questions. One was, the more you talk, the more I was thinking, it's so intensely encapsulated into the term of like stereotype, used prejudice several times, but we have a couple of those positive associations in the way in which the rhetoric might be able to work a little better is to think of it as sort of an extension out from explicitly negative to perhaps a little bit more positive. That's how we get characters, right? I also was thinking the entire time, I wonder what Xenophon has to tell us in the Memorabilia. He's so insistent on talking about how Socrates had nothing to do with the 30. He's the one guy who refuses, right? Really important to bring that up. I was also thinking, you brought up the clouds, which is absolutely right. But this development surely must be connected with the 5th century democracy and the questions of things like parousia. And I was thinking, the knights and the movement, that supposed shift which Aristophanes himself claims, I have created a new type of, means of slandering public officials and of the flexibility that allows to be able to get up and give those speeches, and then of course Cleon, right? Who's so important. He's almost like the sort of diabolē to the extreme. Everything he does has to be an attack on somebody. Somebody is pilfering money. Somebody's taking money. And I've sort of very scatterbrained, I apologize, trying to connect like several of these different points. Because it seems like it's such an important aspect to get to all of these different things to the point where we finally get to the apology, where we see Socrates as sort of like taking the crumbs of all. So I guess, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm grateful. But I also have the sense that I'm a rhetoric nerd, and I'm going to stay in my lane. And if I can provoke a historian like you to think more about the political situation of the 5th century and Cleon and figures like that, I'm thrilled. But I'll let you take it from here. That's kind of, yeah, I'll hand it off. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. That was a really good talk. I got a lot out of it. I just had a question about the word that was that you felt wasn't translated properly, or was a different translation. It was like just instead of condemned, instead of katakria or something else. What was that? What was the word again?
Oh, it's nomizo.
It
It usually means to think or to have as a practice.
Yeah.
Or for instance, Socrates is accused of not believing in the gods that the city believes in. And that's the verb used there.
So I think this choice is actually very. I think it's underlying. There's this underlying tension in this entire. In the way I perceive this, I could be totally off base on this, but there's this underlying tension between what is slander against the conventional social custom of the age versus what against truth or against, and how those two underlying things are juxtaposed with each other. And I think a lot of what Socrates is bringing up, and I think is the fundamental thing of the apology is that Socrates is, in fact, fundamentally coming out against the entire moral and social order of the age, but is doing so in a way where he's juxtaposing himself, is doing so and being in alignment with what should be the proper moral and social order that is not temporal, not spatial. And I think that's, and I think that the juxtaposition between not using katakria for condemn, for me, highlights that juxtaposition in a very, very direct way. That's just something that stuck out for me on it. But I was curious on your thoughts on that, or if you think that's an accurate depiction in terms of how he's approaching slander. Because I think Socrates is slandering the entire moral and social order of the age. But he's saying, I'm justified in doing it. I'm going to do it in a way that's going to try and awaken everyone else to this juxtaposition.
Yeah. Can we call it a critique?
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, it's a wonderful question. And there are so many levels of irony that are going on within the apology. It is a very clever speech. On the other hand, it's a very anti-rhetorical speech, using the techniques of rhetoric. So the prosecution charge is that he doesn't believe in the gods, and he gives this whole that the city believes in, and then he gives this whole defense based on his belief in his own daimonion, which he claims that is somehow derived from the Olympian gods, so he must believe in the Olympian gods. But does he? So there are lots of nifty levels there. But of course, the one person we can say is not guilty of this sort of slander of Socrates or of Athens is Herodotus. And that text is from Herodotus, which is probably from the late 430s. So another 30 years before Socrates is put on trial. And yeah, I mean, it's just a peculiar use of of that particular verb, the dictionaries, the lexica should probably make allowance for it because its meaning in that context seems pretty clear. Ethan?
That was wonderful speech. I was struck by sort of the list of age-based or stereotypes as characterizations. I was wondering if you see a connection sort of between that exercise of characterization and, for example, the epithea or the characterization. I mean, what it reminds me of the characters in the Athenian New Comedy. So I wonder whether you see a generic relationship there in terms of this is something that people are developing, or technique people are developing in different genres for these.
Yeah, thanks. We have to imagine Theophrastus putting his final touches on his rhetoric at the same time that he's got his young student Theophrastus at his elbow, thinking up, now what can I do? And he writes these brilliant character sketches called The Characters, and they're actually all negative. I mean, they're all ridiculing, and there's a long history of scholarship saying this is all tied to new comedy. So in a sense, probably, it's a little bit removed from that. But in this paper, I'm doing this idea that this account of character, which the famous account of character is one that says, in order for a speaker to be credible, he has to have prudence and virtue and goodwill toward the audience. And if he's got those three things covered, no one could ever think him not to be a credible speaker. And that has been the big seminal idea. But he does that at the beginning of book 2 of the Rhetoric. And then he comes along with this account of Athos halfway through book 2 of the Rhetoric. And people have said, what do we do with this? This doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have anything to do with virtue or prudence. I mean, in fact, clearly what comes out of Aristotle's teaching on character about prudence and virtue and goodwill is that if you want to attack a person's credibility, you should just say that he's not virtuous, that he's a fool, and that he hates the audience, right? But that's not what he does. And in fact, in his account of the parts of a speech, he says nothing about this seminal idea of the nature of Athos. He finds all kinds of ways of talking about other things. And so I think he's doing a little bit of cutting and pasting and putting things in other places. And this is where we can use the Rhetoric to Alexander as a kind of control to say, okay, the original text is more like the Rhetoric to Alexander. Aristotle makes these innovations, but then he's taken out the idea of what to do about diabolē in the introduction. And so he moves it to these other chapters in the middle of book 2. This is an idea I haven't seen in the scholarship yet, so I'm keen to push forward with it. Anyway, that's not exactly what you're asking about, but there it is.
Any other questions for
Oh, I'll give it a shot. I'm not sure where the point came that I was supposed to lose track, but I did lose track, certainly. I mean, this is far outside what I normally work, but there was on slide 18 at the bottom, there was an entrance slide at the bottom. There was something that came up, a substitution.
Oh, there it is.
I think maybe I'm mistaken, it might have been 17. It was a substitution of truth for the common good down there. And I'm curious about that. Truth, my understanding of truth is that we generally take it from something that transcends history and culture. It's something more universal, something Plato might have left behind. But the common good is something that's very much located, it's contextual. So it seems to me a pretty significant shift in language. And I'm wondering where that might have, what prompted that? How did that come about? Or am I just making a mountain out of a molehill?
No, it's worth asking why. I think why Anaximenes wants to talk about the common good is that he's talking about character not just in the forensic, not just in the law court situation. Socrates is on trial,
right?
So he's got that specific situation, and he in a law court situation, the argument is it guilty or innocent? What's the truth?
Based on the facts, which are either true or false.
Which, yeah, well,
We hope.
facts or non-facts. So in a law court situation, truth is the thing, whereas Anaximenes is thinking more broadly, and his first area to think about is actually the deliberative situation. We want to do legislation, follow proposals that pursue the common good, and people, so that would be my explanation of that.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. That was like way beyond however much I've read Plato and Aristotle, but I've made an attempt of what I want to ask. So it seems like in the concept of slander, there are a few things which are important. One of them is the content of slander. So it really matters that he's being slandered for that he's speaking the truth from. Because it wouldn't matter if he's eating dirt. Like if there's slandering going on about him eating dirt, it wouldn't matter on the trial. But the content of that slander seems to matter. So I'm just wondering whether that's constituted within the definition of slandering as to whether the content of it would matter or not. Is it?
Well, yes. I mean, my point right at the beginning was that people are using diabolē for things that aren't illegal. And it's not actually illegal to eat dirt. But if you're putting a guy on trial for being an atheist and he eats dirt, it doesn't look good.
Yes.
So yeah, I think you got that, how I was trying to parse that.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, thanks.
My second son used to eat dirt all the time. He'd go to the back garden and just feast.
I think a chalk eater.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, I used to bite my twin all the time. But he bit me.
Don't let that come out.
Any other questions? No? Okay, then I will read my last page. I got put at the back here. There we go. Yep. No. Okay. Well, thank you again, David, for a really insightful talk. And thank you all for attending. This wraps up 2025 for us in terms of the speaker series. And we look forward to seeing you again next semester on Friday, January 16th. Yeah. With a PhD student in the Department of History, Naz Vardar. And keep an eye out on our website for more information.